to Innovative Cities. My name is Israel Banks. I'm the host, and today with me there we have Jack Cochran. He has been practicing architecture for a very long time. He's been an educator at Boston Architectural College for almost a decade. He was my professor for thesis, and this is behind me is my thesis. What else? Go ahead, Jack, tell us more about yourself.
Sure, great. Well, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure also to see your thesis behind you, knowing all the great work you did for that. And to continue, I think, talking about some of the same issues that you were starting to get at the thesis. So I'm really happy to be here. Thanks again for having me.
Thanks for coming.
Absolutely. Yeah, I've had a diverse background. I have, as you mentioned, worked in architecture and education for a long time. I've taught at the BAC, classes ranging from community engagement to advanced studios, where we take on issues like resiliency and larger scale urbanist questions, as well as thesis, which is of course where I met you. And thesis I've been teaching for probably 6 or 7 years now. So a lot of projects of varying scopes. And it's been really interesting to see where the students have taken it. Professionally, in my career, I have always tried to bridge the gap between architecture and urban planning. It was a long interest of mine, even back to my undergrad at the University of Minnesota. I did 2 degrees, both in undergrad and at the master's level, both in architecture and in urban studies. So I've tried to bridge the two for as long as I can. It's always been an interest of mine to go back and forth between the scales where we can deal with sustainability at the building scale, but then also at the urban scale as well. So my work experience has kind of gone back and forth between the two, where I've been involved in environmental impact statements for light rail lines between Minneapolis and St. Paul. And so that was one of the first things I did at a much broader urban scale, which I'm sure we'll get into a little bit as well, talking about how important transportation systems can really influence the way cities work. And then through a series of architectural firms after my graduate studies, that where I've dealt with different scales from 70,000 square foot academic buildings to a house that I'm working on now out on Shelter Island. So it's been fun to kind of balance all of this and seeing how we can integrate sustainability, the notion of craft, happiness, and how people experience built space. So that's sort of where I've had my career.
What an amazing journey.
So far it's been fun.
So how do you see students grow, like when they come first and they graduate, and over the years you've been doing this for a very long time. So, and I'm sure like each year there are new trends and new information. How does that feel like?
Yes, it's certainly been a challenge. I try to impart as much as I can. And of course, I'm still a relatively young architect, and I always think back to my professors and how much experience they've had and everything that they've imparted. So I'm sure that some lessons that I've given to you over the course of the years, or other students as well, come from them, whether directly or indirectly. But I've tried to do my best to stay fresh with latest projects and latest research. And I think thesis in particular is a lot of fun because I get to experience your research as well as other students along with my input. So I'm able to contribute things that I know, as well as see where the research takes you and other students. The interesting thing, at least at the BAC, is that we run the class not as an individual advisor basis, which is typical for most schools. My thesis at the University of Virginia, I spoke with one professor in particular who was an expert in what I had studied, which is not something that we do at the BAC. So it allows me to get engaged with wherever you all want to go with your theses. And so I've been able to guide you all a little bit in terms of resources to look at, but in a lot of cases, I learn a lot from you as well, and try to take in all the research that you do, as well as other students, and see where things go. And it's been really interesting for me to see how, you and I had a year together, and thesis is typically a year, and then I've had other students for maybe a semester at a time or a little bit longer, and then I intersect with them again at later points, and it's always great to see how they have moved beyond the class that they took to do things of their own, and they're fully engaged, pursuing their dreams. One student in particular that I had, who was also at the BAC and also a thesis student, was a woman named Maya Burton Murphy, who was starting to try to make students that wouldn't necessarily be exposed to architectural or design education be able to give them access to that. And she actually ended up starting a nonprofit as part of her thesis, and now she's working in Chicago as part of Chicago Mobile Makers to essentially take a truck around that she designed during thesis to go and deliver design education with 3D printers and laser cutters and all sorts of tools to different parts of Chicago. And so she's, continuing to do that work that I think she has her foundation in thesis and through her other experiences. So yeah, it's always a pleasure to work with people directly and then be able to see what they do with it.
Yeah, I've seen the Chicago Makers. It's an amazing project. I was there on her thesis review and her final, and I've been watching her journey over the years. It's awesome. And probably this would tie us up to the topic we're talking about today is intervention points. So I don't know from her, if you've been following, what do you think? How did that impact the community she's in?
Yeah, I think I know that one thing we'll be talking a lot about is the notion of systems thinking and leverage points, and Donella Meadows' book in particular. So essentially, the purpose behind this way of thinking is not necessarily to take on a problem and try to solve it through a direct means. It's through understanding the ways in which societal impacts, economic systems, whatever it might be, impacts a problem that you're trying to solve. And so by understanding the broader system behind it, you can start to identify what Donella Meadows calls leverage points in that system. So you're able to see, if I tweak one thing, it'll have a ramification on something else. If I tweak this other thing, it'll have a ramification in a different way. And it's a very complicated thing, and each system, of course, is different. And so if you're taking this notion of educating students that might never have had any exposure to design, which is what Maya has been doing, I think that she's actually getting, she's able to change the way in which they see the world, the way they have access to education at a very early age, which hopefully then will influence the way that they work in the future. So even if they don't go into something like you and I have gone into, which is architecture, urban design, they can still use the creative thinking, creative process, methodology paradigm that we have learned and apply that to other things. And for me, that's really important in, getting at some of the other things that we're probably going to be talking about, which is how do you rethink the way that cities as a whole can function? What are things that we typically do that we only do because we've seen them done that way, and we're told by other people that that's the way that we should do things? But if we're trying to solve various problems, whether it's stormwater management or dealing with water in a better way in cities or educating kids, I think there's different ways that once we have the leverage to do so, we have the intention, we have the understanding, we can actually think about the systems that are impacting a city and change them for the better. So it's, for me, this framework is a really important way of thinking through things.
Can we use this system to create a paradigm shift? There was a recent discussion between architects, mostly older and few younger architects, who think the general public, especially in the suburbans, which is probably 85 or 90% of our built environment, they're not interested in architecture designed by architects. They're not interested in new modern architecture, not even modern construction methods. So someone would say, we're still using 17th century building techniques. And people would argue that we want a house that feels like a house. So
yeah,
this is not sustainable as architects. We know this is, we need more energy efficient. We want to make architecture and good design available, to make it more affordable in general, or good design available to more people. So can we use a system interventions method in creating such a huge paradigm shift? Can we do that, something like that? Or the first argument, is it right to create a shift?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many questions embedded in that question that I think it'll be fascinating to unpack, because for me, it gets at the heart of two critical issues. One is for architects, what we do professionally, where we have learned so much and we can think about things differently, challenge some of these questions, but then we're also pigeonholed to some extent in the way that practices have been run historically, which don't necessarily allow us to get at the questions that I think you're talking about. But then the other question is, how do we solve the issue of the suburbs? And of course, that by itself is this very complicated problem where we know by looking at a lot of the data that being dependent on cars, making us all drive from our homes all the way into the city is a huge expense of energy. We know that it takes up a lot of land. And typically it was former farm fields and green fields that those homes are built on. There isn't necessarily the mix of program in suburban areas where there's really just a separation between residential areas and commercial areas where you have to drive to the mall or to some kind of grocery store or shopping area. So many, I think, embedded questions and issues in the way that the suburbs are set up. At the same time, we have to deal with all the advantages that the suburbs do pose for people. So there's a lot of people, and I know many of them myself. My parents, for example, live in the city of St. Paul, but they're within a home that could be called suburban. There's a little bit more space than what you typically get in a suburban environment. My in-laws live in the suburbs of DC, and people desire having a little bit more space. It's also generally cheaper, despite how much transportation you have to get into the city. So there's a lot of opportunity for people in the suburbs that they may not have had in the city necessarily, as cities become more expensive and people start to return to the city. So there's a lot of issues I think that we have to start to unpack. And I think some of the things I was just mentioning, if we think about it from a systems perspective, both the suburbs in general and the built environment that we've created, but then also architects' roles in contributing to that or not. There's so many parts that we have to look at. The first is, can people afford living in the cities should they want to? Sometimes the answer is no. How can we improve the notion of what a house is in the suburbs, not just in terms of aesthetics and not doing the same thing that every other developer is doing, but also improve it in terms of energy efficiency, aesthetics, the way that the home itself is laid out contributes to the daily life of a family. And how do we provide this notion of open space and community in either case? I mean, these are all questions that I think we have to start taking on, because a lot of times, despite anything that you and I would talk about and other architects would talk about, people do really prefer the suburbs in a lot of ways. I think there's a lot of people that love living in cities. I'm one of them. And I think there's a lot of other people that do as well. But there's a lot of people that live in the suburbs and love doing so as well, and would not change. So I think when we think about it from a systems perspective about what we can do as architects in that role, there's a lot. And I'll just offer a couple of potential ideas. The first is that as a financial model, architecture firms don't typically do mass-produced homes. That's something that we think of as slightly taboo. It's something that we just say developers are going to handle. And they have the economics all worked out in the sense that they're mass-producing the houses. They have the contractors, they have the carpenters, they have everybody on board to be able to build a certain number. And they can do so more cheaply than I think a lot of architects can, because they have that repetition. They're not pushing a new design in each case. But if any architect goes through pretty much any school in the United States, and I have no idea what else it is in other countries, but I assume there's some similarities, you are encouraged to think of something new each time. We typically are put, at least at the residential scale for single home, into very custom, highly custom homes for typically wealthier individuals, because they can afford to pay for our time. We come up with very specific spaces for them and their families, and the homes are often different. So if you go to any architecture website in which they have done single family homes, you're not going to see the same home twice. You're going to see different homes. They would never, at least in my opinion, admit that they are using similar details from one project to another. They would be essentially saying we're doing these highly custom homes for people. And so like the business model of making slight tweaks to a home that we would make for a different family is something that I have never heard any of my professors discussing. It's something that I've never heard any of my bosses at various architectural firms discussing either. But obviously we both know the amount of labor that goes into designing a fully custom home, and then that's reflected in the cost. So in terms of systems thinking, this is something that we have to think about as an architects in terms of the financial side. if we were to take on projects in the suburbs and we were to take on this notion of designing 10 homes using similar details, or we just did one home and then we used a very similar home for somebody else, there's a financial gain for us to use our own details from projects before. We're not recreating all the drawing sets, all the pages each time. But then the labor cost is going to be cheaper for people as well. So I'm sure that there are architecture firms out there that do this kind of thing, and I'm just not aware of necessarily who they are, the projects. But and I'm speaking more to my exposure in the field, which has gone all throughout the East Coast and Minnesota and so on. But that could be something that if we put our energies into, not this paradigm, this mindset of every home we have to do, every project we have to do is fully custom. That's one way of, I think, increasing our clientele, and we could be able to do something that's a little bit less expensive, a little more targeted to people who might be in the suburbs. So that's just one example. And then you could do a different version in the city, where we're like, maybe we should actually be providing as much open space in the city as we can with green space, balconies, to try to give people in the cities what people are looking for in the suburbs as well. So there's a lot of ways in which I think we can start to think about things differently.
Thank you, Jack, for this response. It makes me very happy. Recently, probably last week, I don't know if the podcast is published or not, but the original interview with Michael Gerber, the author of the E-Myth, an E-Myth Revised, an E-Myth Architect, was a guest. I'm also going to link the link to the interview with our in the comment section. He was a guest on Entree Architect. That's and Context and Clarity. That's a show for business development. Doesn't have much focus on architecture, but he criticized architects for not being innovative, or at least that was my understanding. He says you're not making architecture available to the 99%. Make it more accessible. And I was a guest on the takeaway, and I said something similar to what you just. We have to create systems and make it more affordable, just like Mercedes. Or it doesn't have to be a cheap car. It doesn't have to be a bad design. It can be, but we can make it more affordable instead of creating one car a year, different car every year. We can create like 100 houses. Each architect will create 100 houses a year and repeat it.
Yeah, I can imagine. And it shakes up a lot of the ways in which the architectural financial system has been set up. I mean, and of course there are, as I'm thinking about this as we're talking, there are of course lots of modular home companies out there that are doing essentially what we're talking about, but they're not typically of a scale that I think we are probably talking about that would compete directly with a suburban home that's maybe 1,500 square feet, something of that nature. So there are people who are doing things that we're talking about, but it's not typical for the architectural profession. It's just the way that we've had the financial system set up. I mean, there are, of course, other parts of the system at play that can start to do positive impacts. Code, of course, is one that's really important that the contractors and developers would have to follow them no matter what. The house I'm working on right now in Shelter Island has had a really significant increase in its energy code. And I've had to replace the windows, making sure that I'm up to their standards. And I always try to put sustainability as a high goal for my projects, but even these codes are pushing window requirements to an extent that I'm having to specify new windows as a result. So in terms of the systems at play that influence what other people are doing, in addition to architects getting involved in some of these questions more directly and purposefully, code officials, policy setters, they can also have a really significant role at, I think, an even broader scale. I would love to think of you and me and other architects taking on some of these issues more directly. I think we're also pulled in the direction that clients want us to go, which is one of the problems. But even if you had every architect in the world involved in the things that we're talking about, you still will have developers who are doing homes all across the country. And code, I think, is going to be probably the most impactful way that you can influence energy efficiency, the way in which the home or landscape is dealing with water infiltration to try to capture water instead of just sending it to runoffs. So planners and policymakers really have a big role as well.
So if we want to come up, I know this is like a very loaded question, but if we want to come up with a strategy to shift the public from, I think it's on us architects to shift the public standpoint of their understanding to architecture and the built environment, shift it from the traditional, I want a home that looks like my grandparents, to more focused on sustainability, efficiency, hire an architect, make an architect. Where should we start?
Yeah, another great loaded question. It's hard because I feel like in some ways, I'm not sure that modern architecture has done everything that it needs to in terms of inspiring the public to want those homes. I think there's a rejection of ornamentation. There's a rejection of a lot of the principles that prior architects celebrated. That I think in some of the worst cases, I think of modern architecture, it's not something that the typical layperson would necessarily want to live in. They have strong memories of where they've been in. We also have film, TV, everything that's pushing us in a direction that is celebrating this idea of a wealthy homeowner in a Tudor style mansion, whatever it might be, that reinvigorates a lot of the historic architectural lenses. I also love a lot of those architectures too. Whenever I go travel, I go see modern structures all the time and enjoy doing those. I've seen them, but I also love seeing classical buildings. I love seeing Baroque buildings. I love seeing a lot of the styles and ways of building that have happened over the centuries. Just admiring the way that they're assembled and the attention to composition and everything else that they've done. So there's a lot of answers to your question. I feel like the first is that we need to continue to build on our notion of aesthetics and materiality and tectonics in our age. And I think that, like, for example, the image behind you, celebrating the inclusion of ecology, natural systems in a city is something that I think cities historically have always needed. And I think we've continued to push them out. So I think that could be a critical part of making our designs and aesthetics better in the 21st century. The other part of it is, I think, education for somebody who's either buying or building a home. Because we've had so much cultural material that reinforces old historic styles. I think if you look closely at modernist structures in films, they potentially could be a part of a villain's house as much as a modern family's house. So there's a kind of underlying cultural preference. The same thing goes for urban living versus rural living. Whether you're talking about Star Wars, or you're talking about any other film, there's this notion of like a rural character as being the model citizen, the most moral person fighting against corruption, which would often be kind of located in the cities. So there's a lot of cultural issues that I think, if we're thinking systemically, we can start to create more and more films that are actually putting ethical, good characters in a city that are imagined in a way that I think that we would all want them to be. To keep with science fiction, I think films like Star Trek or others start to lend this notion of what a futuristic environment could be in a positive way. That's a dense urban environment, but that's also fairly rare. So I'm kind of going off on tangents here, but
I think that's a great point.
The main thing I think in terms of people wanting to choose particular home styles, and style I think is a loaded term there, comes down to their education about it. So one, they've been influenced by these cultural issues. Two, they're influenced by their memory, places that they had been and warmed to. And three, I think it comes down to really, a lot of the ways of building in the past are beautiful. There's a lot of ways, different admirations I have for old building styles, whether we're talking about Gaudi's buildings or we're talking about something from the Beaux-Arts. There's a lot of ways in which I think we can create architecture that works. As an architect, I have a problem designing. If you ask me to put capitals on or columns on the front of the building, I would have a problem doing that because I know a couple of things about building architecture. And one of them is, one, the way in which we build now and the materials and the knowledge of the contractors. And then two, the symbol of what that's supposed to mean. So the reason why we see columns on the front of buildings, whether we're talking about the Capitol building here in DC or others, we are trying to infuse, or historically did infuse, this notion of democracy and Greek architecture into our identity. which to me, I understand, but I also see it as a symbol or a metaphor that is a kind of surface application to what's actually going on inside. Like I'm much more interested in the way in which conversations happen inside the Capitol and people on either side of the aisle can collaborate, and how architecture can support that. That's, if I was doing a re-version of the Capitol, those are the questions that I would ask. I wouldn't be thinking about columns on the front and the sort of the way in which it's made. Which I think is going to be strange for anybody who's not an architect to understand. So for me, one is this metaphor that I think to me feels superficial. So I'm not going to do that when I do my work, unless a client demands it. But the other part of it comes down to materials and the ways in which people build today. So for me to see steel structures clouded up in other ways, you have a brick facade, you have it wrapped in a column that's not actually structural. To me, that gives a level of dishonesty to the way that the architecture is produced, that I would rather acknowledge the time in which we're building. This is the 21st century, it's 2021. We have particular knowledge sets, we have new requirements that have emerged, certainly from the time that they were building temples and the Parthenon. So I'm sort of in this mindset that I think we should be not necessarily honest about the way that the materials are demonstrating how the building is working, but I don't think that we need to be disguising the way in which we build buildings now in a set of clothing that somebody from Greece, millennia ago would have understood. Mostly because structural requirements are different, right? So they didn't necessarily even have an arch. They had small beams under these enormous capitals. Now we have steel that can go much further. Our understanding of fire and what we have to do in order to protect people on the inside has changed significantly. And I don't mean for this to be in any way insulting to the traditions of Vitruvius or anyone who has been built in the past thousands of years, because I think they all demonstrated an incredible amount of knowledge, technique, using what they had, local materials, the technology that they had, and the awareness they had. I'm just saying that I think most people are not aware of what we do today as architects and how actually challenging it can be to create a truthful version of an older building. Whether we're talking about a brick arch, which is beautiful, there's a lot more labor in it than we would typically think of. There's a lot of questions about that I think we have to start to balance and also educate our potential clients, or to your other question, people in the suburbs, about what's expected in a house today. So I think we should be open and honest about where materials are coming from, what the best and most efficient way of creating a great home is, what materials those require, and let that and our social structures and the way that we want spaces to work that would, are different than in centuries past. Let those questions guide how we build. But yeah, I mean, the problem is that I don't think people are necessarily aware that those are the questions that architects try to solve. They are rooted in these notions of the past, as you were mentioning, as opposed to thinking about how we might solve that problem. So I think that's kind of a long way of answering a critical question to getting people to accept new ways. But I think if we can start to not necessarily change their paradigm, but at least give them extra information about how we work and why we do things a certain way, then they perhaps will be more open to building that way. They may still hate the architecture. They may be a very prominent classicist and love, those types of buildings. And I'm sure there's an architect out there that would build for them as well, but perhaps not you and me.
Yeah, in the past year, I had 2 clients ask me for columns, portico, or something else like a pergola. And the reason behind it was for curb appeal. I was like, but
sure. Yeah, I think those are interesting questions, right? Because like porches are fantastic. Porches do, especially in southern climates, they help shade the southern facade from extreme sun. You can create a comfortable space to be. It can invite wind in. Pergolas, all of those things have, I think, elements that we still use and should be using, even if it's just a simple post to hold up a canopy of some sort. I mean, that's a very elemental thing. So
But they
Well, I
were
guess what I've
not
tried to
doing
do,
the purpose they should have been doing. The client
right?
wanted them for curb appeal. One of them was in a school directly under a huge evergreen tree that already
Mhm.
provides ample shade, and it was like, this is not the right place to have it.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, and I
they,
think it's, when you're having those conversations with clients, it's, like I think we have to be sensitive to their need to be able to sell their home for more money later. I mean, that's always something that I think they get ingrained in thinking about. But are there questions that we can ask them to say, hey, I understand your goal here. Here's the way that I see it. Like, can we think about this in a slightly different way to, yes, still make your home profitable, to have it be appealing from the street for when people walk by, to be able to sell it later, but also not necessarily try to mimic a style that you and I necessarily aren't agreed with. I think then you'll prompt this really interesting conversation where they have to either go with somebody else, or they'll like defend their own opinion about it, and you'll have an honest conversation about what it is about aesthetics, about symbol for the former houses, and get at least them to think about like, hey, this is why we don't do things necessarily one way or the other. Have a better understanding of where they're coming from, and hopefully there's a middle ground that you can find between the two.
yeah, definitely, yeah. The problem is most people get their knowledge from HGTV, and the
Yeah.
architect's voice is poorly represented in these shows.
Mhm.
So probably that's one of the system interventions we can use
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, even a version of this interview, being able to get out material on YouTube to help people, maybe they'll stumble across a conversation about it, to understand different perspectives than what you might see on HGTV. I mean, I've certainly watched shows. I don't watch them very often, but I know generally how they'll come in and magically figure out something for very cheap, and um, not necessarily either honor the home that was there previously, or that they're still kind of living in and modifying. There's also a very weird representation, I think, of architects, in the sense that they come in very briefly and say a couple of things, and then that's all the work you have to do, and belies, I think, all of the levels of detail and the careful consideration we do, testing materials, putting sheets together for contractors to be able to resolve. But I think what's also interesting, back to our conversation before about the money system that pays architects and clearly establishes our value or not to a client. If they're seeing people like on HGTV, oh, I had this architect come in for 30 seconds and they gave their opinion about the house, and then the contractor is able to replicate to a fair extent what the vision was, then that questions, what is the architect really there for? If the contractor can do a lot of the things and they're really just looking for you for some ideas, then that's a problem. So I think we have to think about what our role is as architects relative to contractors. Of course, historically, the architect was much more involved in construction, leading a lot of the work. The master builder is the trope historically. And as litigation has become more common and architects have separated themselves from the job site, and there's a clear division of labor between the means and methods of making a building and then the contractual documents that we make as a drawing set, we need to be able to still demonstrate what our value is, even though a lot of the construction for liability reasons is fully in the hands of the people who are insured to do the building. And I like to think that what we provide is a clear understanding of what the client values, and have conversations with them and try things and test things. And so when they're going to go spend $1 million on a house, or $200,000 on a house, or $30 million on a bigger building, that they know exactly what they're getting ahead of time. We have representation. We literally are making the contract documents for them, so that we can test all of those ideas, make sure everything's ready to go safely for much less money before it then gets set to the contractor. But again, that's probably not most people's experience, as you're mentioning. They'll look at HGTV, get a fully different impression of what that is. But at the same time, I think it does raise really interesting questions for, at that scale, getting back to the conversation we're having about architects working in the suburbs on a single family home. Really, what is the division of labor there, and how are we useful? I would hate for us to be thinking at that scale, we're not relevant. We could just give some quick ideas and then the contractor will take care of it. unless it's a $2 or $3 million house and above, or a bigger building. Like I would love for us to be involved a little bit more because we have a lot to contribute, but we do have to fight against those misperceptions.
So going back to cities, can we blend the boundaries between cities and suburbia? And from your experience as an architect / urban planner, how would that might work out?
Another great question. What I found interesting about the light rail project that I worked on, this was between Minneapolis and St. Paul. Minneapolis is probably 300, 400,000 people. St. Paul is maybe 250. But the metropolitan region as a whole, there's a lot of suburban development in there. I think we're probably up to 3 million people for the Twin Cities as a whole. Because it's so cold, we have a lot of focus on cars because it's also a northern Midwestern city that was established, I think, after 1850. We have a lot of focus on cars, a lot of space for cars to move around, and then people will, instead of taking mass transit, they will jump in their car in their heated garage, go to their downtown office in another heated garage. And then we also have this skyway system in downtown Minneapolis that allows you to move between downtown office buildings without ever going outside, which of course has its own problems, but it's essentially a climate strategy to deal with how cold it can be there in the winter. So when I was involved with the light rail line, there was already one system that was connecting to the airport to go to downtown Minneapolis. And so now we were trying to stitch the two cities together. What became very clear with the Metropolitan Council, who's responsible for the whole metropolitan region, was that they wanted to think of it as a transit-oriented development strategy. So not only were we providing mass transit to go between the two downtowns, we were also creating a new demand for homes, for offices at each of the stops. And so they simultaneously with the plan for the light rail line had plans for each of the major locations. And now you'll see things like a new soccer stadium at one of the stations, and then some other developments, some of the downtown locations that have been catered to these locations. And of course, there were consequences that came with it. I think gentrification has increased in that corridor. There's a bunch of negative effects as well. So we have to consider all of that as we're thinking about this. But the line of thought that I was thinking about in terms of connecting the suburbs to these areas is that if we're able to have these transit-oriented development locations along a light rail line, there's no reason why that can't extend out into the suburbs. So historically, we had streetcar suburbs, which before cars really became commonplace, I'm thinking of late 1800s, early 1900s, we would have a cluster of development around a station, and then it would start to thin out and then would build up again at those stations. And that was, a lot of the way in which inner ring suburbs had developed before cars really became common. So as we were talking about before, with a lot of the suburban development being focused just on residential neighborhoods, and then there are these clusters of shopping malls and big box stores and grocery stores somewhere else, cities are starting to try to encourage mass transit access to some of the suburbs. And so around each of those train stations that they're inevitably going to have, whether we're talking about DC here, or we're talking about Minneapolis, St. Paul, where they're starting to stretch those train access points further, you're going to see increased development around those points, which I think is a good thing. So you're starting to see some urban moments, which is this kind of confluence of program, whether we're talking about residential apartments or offices or retail around these nodes, that then give people a little bit of an access point to that when they, eventually go out, some of them out to their homes. You're starting to blur the boundaries a little bit there, I think. To me, I think that's a positive way, and I think we have to continue to push that in cities across the country, which I think recent investments into infrastructure hopefully are going to go that way. We'll start to see train lines going out a little bit further, bringing them in, and having urban style development in suburban pockets. At the same time, we could talk about the pandemic and work from home and how that's really shaking up a lot of that model. But so we'll see how it kind of goes back in the next 10 years or so after we emerge from that. But the other answer to your question, the other way, blurring the suburbs into the cities, is I think a really interesting question as well. And when I say that, I don't mean the scale of the suburbs and the disassociation between homes or residents or businesses at all. What I mean is the access to vegetation, the access to the outdoors, I think is becoming a really prominent agenda for a lot of city makers around the world. I mean, you'll see in New York, where I just moved from, lots of new parks that have gone up. There's, the High Line, there's Little Islands, there's a bunch of others that are certainly expensive, but give people within a very dense environment access to the outdoors. And, your thesis, for example, or we talk about Bjarke Engel's work, where there's a series of balconies and a multifamily home is no longer this straight up building where you don't have access to the outdoors, but there is some measure of green space directly accessible to your house. Then you have that private outdoor space. Although it's smaller, you have it within the city, and then it's accessible to a lot of the other things that you care about. So my hope is that we start to bring in biodiversity, a lot more vegetation into the cities, because I think that's going to make it much more livable. The air will be cleaner, we'll be able to deal with water better. And there's a lot of research too about the notion of biophilia and the effects that has on our psychology, that we tend to be happier around plants because that's how we evolved. And I think that's, one way in which we can learn from the suburbs. I tend to think of the suburbs as a pretty monocultural place in terms of biodiversity with a lot of lawns. So I think we can do better than that as we're bringing in plants back into the city. But I think the goal is there. Like, there's a lot that we can learn from exposure to the outdoors, being able to walk and run around, have our kids or dogs or whatever running around, and seeing plants on a regular basis that historically, unfortunately, have not really been very common in cities themselves.
Yeah, I think probably you answered my next question, but I'm going to ask it again. If you have given all the resources that you've wished for, how would a utopian city would look like for you? What would you do?
Yeah, again, a very interesting question. I think the goal that we have to think about is not necessarily the forms that we've done historically, because there's a lot of advantages to, for example, the thesis that you designed, whether we're talking about the inner core of Barcelona and medieval city and how intricate and connected pedestrian-wise that is to one another, or to the advantages of suburban locations. I mean, Frank Lloyd Wright and his Usonia homes, and he had a whole series of ideas about how to make the suburbs good and access to the outdoors. So I feel like I'm hoping a happy medium between all of those different perspectives, where we're starting to borrow from suburban locations and rural locations in terms of our access to the outdoors, but also the clear advantages that come in terms of access to jobs, access to each other, and energy efficiency that come with cities. I mean, we all know, you and I know, and it might be worth mentioning, the amount of, when you're heating your apartment, if part of that heat goes into the next room over, then you're saving energy, you're helping to limit the amount of heat that you need for your given apartment, because you're all essentially sharing shared walls and heat. So how do you balance that with access to the outdoors and actually giving people the psychological sense of relief? And like, I lived in New York for a long time, and I found it to be wonderful in a lot of ways, also very stressful because of all the activity, lack of vegetation in certain areas. So yeah, I guess I don't have a necessarily a notion in my mind of what this happy utopia middle ground looks like, but it is something like what you have behind you. It is something that is merging the advantages of both. Yeah, it's I hope that the agenda for architecture and for urban planning in the next century, as we deal with climate change becoming a real issue, and seeing the effects of it, is that we're able to make cities be efficient, be resilient, be much more vegetated, so that we can, have some measure of biodiversity around us, be able to handle the requirements that I think ecology and ecological systems need in cities, while also dealing with the suburbs as they are. Like, I think if we can densify the suburbs a little bit, but just understand that realistically, we're never going to get everybody to come into a much more dense environment, but be able to think of it as a whole, a metropolitan region that does have a limit. It's not going to further stretch into farmland. It's not going to further stretch into forests that we might be setting aside as national parks. There is a limit to the way we're building cities. We take care of the urban environment. We take care of the suburban environment. There is this kind of blurring that you're talking about that will provide the ecological balance that we need, no matter how we choose to live and in what density. So I think there's a lot of work for us to do. hopefully we get the chance to do it.
Well, thank you very much, Jack, for sharing your knowledge with us. It's been a really great interview.
Sure thing. Well, thanks for having me. I think there's a lot of questions. This is giving me lots of ideas for even more stuff to talk about and problems to solve. So I think hopefully anybody watching this understands the scope of potential that comes with the questions that we're trying to answer and how we deal with that from an economic perspective so that we can run our firms and do the work that I think we need. There's a lot of really intriguing questions to be thinking about and working on.
Also, thank you to our viewers, and see you in another episode.